Blood dripped from Ragnar's axe as he stared at the Saxon prisoner tied to the tree. The moonlight revealed the enemy's battered face, but also something more, a strange familiarity in the foreigner's eyes that froze the berserker's arm at the decisive moment. The blade trembled in the air. For the first time in his violent life, Ragnar Wolftooth hesitated before killing. Thank you for joining this journey into the shadows of Viking honor and humanity. This channel is just beginning, and every subscription truly means the world, helping us reach our first 1,000 followers and keep these stories alive. If you find yourself drawn to this tale, please consider subscribing and sharing where you're watching from. Whether a small village or a bustling city, your presence here strengthens this growing community. The cold wind howled through the dense pine forest, carrying the bitter scent of smoke and damp earth that clung to the Viking camp nestled just beyond the edge of the trees. The sky was a heavy canvas of charcoal-gray clouds, threatening snow, but offering only a chill that seeped through thick furs and layered leather. The flickering fires scattered across the clearing cast long, trembling shadows on the rough-hewn wooden huts and tents, weaving an uneasy dance between light and darkness. The scent of roasting meat mingled with the faint tang of blood and sweat, while the distant murmur of voices rose and fell like waves crashing against the distant cliffs. In the heart of this restless camp, Ragnar Thorvaldsson moved with a purposeful stride, his heavy boots crunching on the frozen ground. At 35 winters, his towering presence was impossible to miss. His nearly 2-meter frame wrapped in a dark wool tunic that hung beneath a heavy cloak made from wolf pelts. The edges of the fur were matted with mud and dried blood from recent skirmishes, telling silent stories of survival and battle. His fiery red hair, braided tightly on the sides and falling in thick locks to his broad shoulders, seemed almost aflame against the dull light of the dying day. Scars, like ancient runes etched by war, traced across his pale skin, one carving a deep line through his left eyebrow, lending a fierce permanence to his angular face. The weight of the wolf's teeth, each one a grim trophy from a warrior felled by his hand, pressed heavily against his chest in the form of a necklace. It was a symbol that spoke of both his ferocity and his role within the clan, a reminder that he was no mere soldier, but a berserker, a warrior who had surrendered himself to the raw fury of Odin's blessing. Yet beneath the fierce exterior, Ragnar's eyes, sharp and gray-green as storm-tossed seas, betrayed a flicker of something less certain, a tiredness, a burden, a shadow that gnawed at the edges of his soul. The camp was alive with preparation. Men sharpened axes and swords, grinding metal against stone with rhythmic strokes that echoed in the cold air. Women moved deftly between fires and tents, their voices low and urgent as they prepared offerings and tended to the wounded. Children, bundled in thick furs against the creeping chill, darted between the groan, their laughter brief and brittle, moments of fragile innocence in a world stained by violence. The air was tense with an anticipation deeper than simple celebration. An ancient, sacred weight hung over the camp like the looming clouds above. Ragnar's mind was heavy with the knowledge of what would come at the next moonrise, a night when the blood of a worthy sacrifice would sanctify their people, when the old gods would be appeased by offerings steeped in honor and fear. The prisoner, a Saxon warrior captured in the recent raids, was the centerpiece of this grim rite. His fate was sealed, yet Ragnar's thoughts circled around the man with unsettling persistence. He paused by the fire, its glow lighting the hard lines of his face as he ran a calloused hand through his hair. The crackling flames whispered ancient stories, tales of gods and men, of glory and death, and stirred memories he had long buried beneath layers of rage and discipline. It was a life he'd chosen, or perhaps one chosen for him by fate, but tonight those memories edged closer, unbidden. The scent of pine resin and burning wood filled his nostrils, mingling with the coppery taste of dried blood on his lips. The cold was relentless, biting through the fabric of his clothing and settling in his bones, yet he welcomed the sensation. War had taught him to endure discomfort, to embrace pain as a companion. Still, beneath the warrior's hardened shell, a quiet unease flickered, a question that gnawed at the corners of his mind like a restless wolf at the door. As Ragnar moved through the camp, the eyes of his fellow warriors tracked him with a mix of respect and wariness. To them, he was a figure of legend, a living weapon whose fury in battle had earned him the name Wolf-Tooth. Yet no one saw the loneliness that shadowed his steps, the isolation that had deepened with every raid and every death. The more blood he spilled, the further he drifted from the men who called him brother. He found brief solace in the presence of Thora Volvadatyr, the clan's seer. She was unlike the others, her hair the color of storm clouds, her pale blue eyes clouded with the mist of old visions, and her body bent but unbroken by the shifting tides of time. Her wisdom was a steady flame in the ever-changing darkness, and she alone spoke to Ragnar without fear or reverence, without the weight of expectation that hung on his shoulders. Thora stood near the edge of the encampment, her fingers tracing ancient runes carved into her wooden staff. The soft scrape of leather and the faint crackle of dried leaves underfoot announced Ragnar's approach, but she neither startled nor turned abruptly as he came to stand beside her. "The night will be long," she said quietly, her voice a rasp that seemed to carry the winds of distant storms. "The moon will rise full and bright, and the blood of the Saxon will soak this earth." Ragnar nodded, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "He fights harder than most," he admitted, "but his fate is sealed. Odin demands it." Thora's gaze lingered on him, sharp and knowing. "Odin demands many things, but not always what we think. There are secrets in the shadows of the god's will, paths we fear to walk." The flickering torchlight revealed the lines of age and experience etched into her face, but beneath the surface her eyes burned with fierce certainty. Ragnar respected her, not only as a seer, but as a woman who had survived long enough to see the cycles of blood and ice repeat over generations. "I will watch him myself tonight," Ragnar said, a note of resolve in his voice. "He will not escape." "Still," Thora murmured, "the Saxon is not like the others. There is a strength in him beyond steel and muscle, a spirit that may bind or break." Ragnar looked away, the weight of her words settling like a stone in his chest. He thought of the prisoner, Aethelstan, a man with eyes too bright for the darkness that surrounded them, a man whose silence spoke volumes. He wondered what thoughts crossed that prisoner's mind, what memories haunted him in the cold night. The camp settled into uneasy quiet as dusk deepened into night. Fires burned lower, and the voices faded into murmurs and whispered prayers. The wind carried the distant howl of wolves, an echo of Ragnar's own name and nature. Alone now, Ragnar made his way toward the far side of the camp where the prisoner was kept. The Saxon's quarters were simple, a thick rope looped around a rough pine trunk, binding him fast. His figure was slumped against the bark, his clothes torn and stained, but the firelight caught the resolute tilt of his chin. Even in chains and wounds, there was a dignity that drew Ragnar's reluctant attention. "Do you know what awaits you?" Ragnar asked in the guttural tongue of his people, his voice low but steady. The prisoner lifted his head, blue eyes meeting Ragnar's with an unyielding calm. "Your gods will welcome me," he replied, his voice steady and clear, despite the cold that stiffened his limbs. The words lingered between them, heavy with meaning. Ragnar's grip tightened on the haft of his axe, the cold metal biting into his palm. For years, death had been a certainty in his world, swift, brutal, unquestioned. Yet tonight, something was different. The prisoner's words stirred a flicker of doubt, a crack in the armor forged by blood and battle. "What is your name?" Ragnar demanded, curiosity edging into his tone. "Aethelstan." The name was foreign on Ragnar's tongue, carrying a weight of distant lands and unspoken histories. He studied the man's face, the short, dark hair dusted with frost, the scars that told stories of survival, the slow, steady breath despite chains and wounds. "You fought well," Ragnar acknowledged grudgingly. "3 of my men fell by your hand." Aethelstan's gaze sharpened with the memory. "And I would have killed more if my sword had not broken." A grudging respect flickered between the two, a silent acknowledgment of warriors bound by the same unforgiving fate. The wind whispered louder as night deepened, the moon preparing to cast its pale light across the frozen ground. Ragnar settled onto a nearby stone, the cold seeping through his worn leather. The firelight flickered across the prisoner's face, revealing more than just battle wounds. There was a story etched deep in those eyes, a story of loss, of love, of a life beyond war. "You have a family?" Ragnar said quietly, more statement than question. Aethelstan's eyes softened for a moment. "A wife and 2 sons. I fight to protect them." The words hung heavy in the air. Ragnar's gaze fell to the wolf's teeth resting against his chest, a necklace that told tales of death, but not of life. "I have a son, too," Ragnar admitted after a pause, the confession feeling like a fragile thread stretched between 2 men who should be enemies. "I have never seen him. His mother left while I was away." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle crackling of dying embers and the distant calls of night creatures. In that quiet, 2 warriors, one bound by chains, the other by blood and duty, found a fragile connection. The moon rose slowly, casting silver light that danced across the snow-dusted ground. Ragnar reached out, offering a skin of water to Aethelstan. Their fingers brushed briefly, the touch electric and alien. "If not for tomorrow," the Saxon whispered, "perhaps we might have been friends under different skies." The words settled in Ragnar's mind long after the prisoner's eyes closed in exhaustion. He stood, the weight of his axe grounding him in the present, yet pulling him toward an uncertain tomorrow. He turned away, the cold biting deeper, but the warmth of that brief exchange burned quietly within, a secret shared beneath the moonlight, a moment that would change the course of lives and the fate of a clan. The camp around him slept, but Ragnar's mind raced. The line between warrior and man blurred, and the path ahead was shrouded in shadow and doubt. The dawn crept slowly through the dense pine forest, casting pale shafts of light that barely pierced the lingering mist. The camp stirred with the quiet sounds of waking, tent flaps rustling, low murmurs, the occasional clinking of metal. But for Ragnar, the morning brought no peace. His mind churned with the weight of the night's secret, the unspoken bond that tethered him now to the Saxon prisoner, Aethelstan. The fires burned low, casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits upon the frozen earth.
Around him, the men of the clan moved with purpose, their faces hardened by the unyielding cold and the harsher demands of fate. Yet none of them knew the turmoil that raged within Ragnar's chest, the conflict between duty and something far more fragile, humanity. He pulled his cloak tighter around his broad shoulders, the wolf fur rough against his skin, and stepped away from the shadowed circle of the camp to seek the solitude of the forest's edge. The bitter wind whipped at his hair, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth, but also something else, something unsettling, like a whisper from a world he had long tried to forget. As he walked, the crunch of snow beneath his boots mingled with the distant call of ravens circling overhead. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and iron, but beneath that a faint, almost imperceptible scent reached him. The faint, sweet fragrance of wildflowers, fragile against the harshness of the northern winter. Drawn by the scent, Ragnar's step slowed until he came upon a small clearing bathed in the fragile light of morning. There, curled beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient oak, lay a figure, a child, no more than 7 winters old, shivering and pale. Her tangled hair, dark as raven feathers, was matted with frost, and her garments hung loose and torn, offering little protection against the cold. For a long moment Ragnar stood silent, the wind carrying the child's ragged breaths to his ears like a fragile prayer. The camp was a place of strength and survival, where weakness was often met with harshness or indifference. Yet here, in this quiet glade, the warrior felt something unfamiliar, an ache deep within his chest that he had buried beneath years of bloodshed and solitude. The girl's eyes fluttered open, revealing a gaze that was wide and frightened, but not without a spark of defiance. She lifted a trembling hand, clutching a small wooden talisman carved crudely with the shape of a raven, an emblem of protection, or perhaps a desperate hope. Ragnar's instincts warred within him. The code of the warrior demanded focus on the clan, on the battle ahead, on the rites that must be fulfilled. Yet the child before him was a living testament to the fragile threads that bound this harsh world, a reminder of innocence caught in the crossfire of men's ambitions. Memories surged unbidden, visions of a son he had never met, a child left behind like a ghost in his past. The weight of that loss settled heavily on his shoulders, mingling with the cold until it burned like ice against his skin. He knelt slowly, careful not to startle her, the rough leather of his glove brushing against the brittle fabric of her cloak. "Who are you?" His voice was low, gravelly, but softened by the flicker of something long dormant. The girl's lips parted, words barely audible. "Ira. My name is Ira." The name carried a softness that seemed out of place in a world forged by war.
Ragnar's gaze lingered on her, so small, so vulnerable, yet alive with a quiet strength that defied her fragile frame. "Why are you here, child?" he asked, his breath misting in the cold air. Ira's eyes darted toward the distant camp, where the banners of the Viking clan snapped sharply in the wind. "I ran from the Saxons. They came while I slept. My village burned." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the rustle of branches and the distant calls of the waking forest. Ragnar's mind raced. The Saxon prisoner at their camp was an enemy, yet this child spoke of that same people with a voice woven from fear and loss. Her story clashed violently with everything he had been taught, to see the Saxons as foes, as less than human, as the enemy to be crushed beneath iron and fire. Yet here, before him, was a child whose fate was caught in the same brutal tides. He felt the stirrings of an old conflict, the primal urge to protect, to shield those who could not defend themselves. But to do so would be to invite danger, to risk the wrath of his own clan, to unsettle the fragile order that held their world in place. "Come," he said finally, his voice a growl tempered with care. "You cannot stay here." Ira hesitated, fear flashing across her eyes. "They will find me." Ragnar rose slowly, the weight of his axe heavy at his side as he scanned the shadowed trees. "Then we will face them together." The words surprised even him. There was no room for mercy in the code he had lived by, and yet a sliver of something new took root. A defiance not born from fury, but from something far deeper. As he led the girl back toward the edge of the camp, the cold seemed to intensify, as if the world itself resisted the fragile hope that flickered between them. Shadows lengthened, and voices rose, warriors questioning, suspicion sharpening like the blades they carried. Ragnar's chest tightened with the weight of choices yet to be made. To shield this child was to risk everything: his honor, his place among his people, perhaps even his life. Yet as Ira's small hand found his, clutching tightly, he felt a resolve hardening within him, a promise whispered to the wind and the gods alike. The worlds of Vikings and Saxons, of enemies and kin, were more entwined than he had ever dared to admit. That night, beneath the cold glow of the moon, Ragnar would face the consequences of that promise. But for now, as the camp buzzed with preparation, and the weight of destiny settled heavy on his shoulders, he chose to protect the fragile light of a child caught in the storm. The path ahead was shrouded in shadow and doubt, but the first steps had been taken, steps that would change the course of many lives, and stir the ancient powers that watched endlessly from the silent sky. The cold had not lessened as Ragnar led Ira through the dense forest, his heavy boots crunching on frozen pine needles and brittle leaves. The shadows clung tightly beneath the trees, thick and alive, wrapping around them like silent watchers. Every crack of a twig beneath foot echoed in the stillness, each breath a cloud of mist between them. The girl's small hand remained clasped in his, trembling slightly, but she did not pull away. Instead, a fragile trust seemed to settle between them, an unspoken promise forged in necessity and whispered fear. They moved cautiously, the air thick with tension and the unspoken weight of what lay ahead. Ragnar had no clear plan, only the primal instinct to find shelter before the cold tightened its grip, before the world grew too dark and unyielding for a child alone. His mind flickered to the camp just beyond the tree line, a place of violence and rigid codes. Yet here, walking beneath the skeletal branches, the harshness of the clan seemed distant, almost irrelevant. A few miles east, hidden within a rocky bend of the river, stood a small cabin, weathered by seasons and built with steadfast hands. It belonged to an old friend, a hunter who had long since retired from the endless wars. Ragnar had often sought the quiet refuge there in times of doubt, the simple walls a fortress against the storms both outside and within. As they approached, the faint glow of a dying hearth flickered through the cracks in the wood, casting dancing shadows on the snow. Ragnar pushed open the rough door with a grunt, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The room was sparse but tidy. A rough-hewn table scarred from years of use, a bed littered with fur pelts, and a small rack where dried herbs hung with patient grace. A single lantern cast a steady light, its flicker steady against the creeping cold outside. Ira slipped inside quietly, her eyes wide as they adjusted to the dim warmth. She moved toward the fire, arms wrapped around herself, seeking the heat that seemed to promise safety. Ragnar set the door firmly shut behind them and crossed the room to unlace his heavy cloak, the wolf pelts falling away like a weight lifted. Without a word, he moved to a wooden bench, pulling from his pack a small bundle wrapped carefully in linen. Inside was a chunk of dried venison and a skin of water, simple sustenance but precious in its offering. He tore off pieces of meat, softening it with his fingers, then held it out to Ira. The girl hesitated, eyes flickering with uncertainty. The hunger was clear in the slight tremble of her hands and the faint curve of her ribs beneath the torn fabric of her cloak. Slowly she reached out, taking the meat delicately, and bit down with a small, almost shy hunger. Her eyes met Ragnar's briefly, a fleeting moment, where the walls between them thinned. He watched her eat, noting the way her lips pressed tightly around the harsh meat, the slight wince as the cold seemed to bite through her skin.
There was something fragile beneath the surface, a resilience that tempered her small frame. Her hands trembled as she held the water-skin, and Ragnar's gaze landed on the rough wooden talisman she clutched tightly beneath her cloak, the raven carved crudely but with care. The emblem spoke of something deeper than mere superstition, protection, perhaps, or a silent prayer to unseen forces. "Do you speak?" Ragnar asked softly, his voice low and rough like gravel. Ira's lips moved, barely audible words drifting between them. "A little," she whispered in broken Old Norse, her accent thick but understandable. "I learned from my mother." That name, the language, was a thread connecting them to a past neither fully understood, a convergence of worlds. Ragnar nodded, stepping closer with a small piece of cloth dampened by water. He knelt gently beside her, careful not to startle the fragile child, and began to wipe the grime and frost from the thin lines of her face. There were bruises along her arms, faint but visible, and a small cut above her eyebrow where dried blood had begun to crust. Her skin was cold, pale as winter's own breath, but beneath the surface there was a stubborn spark, life that refused to be snuffed out by the harshness of the world. Ragnar tore strips from his own cloak, softening them with water, and bound the cuts with careful hands. He spoke little, his focus absolute, every movement deliberate and slow. Ira watched him in silence, her blue eyes wide and unblinking, as if trying to understand the man who had taken her from the edge of the world. For a long moment they simply existed in that quiet space. The crackling fire, the soft scrape of cloth against skin, the faint rhythm of breath shared between two souls brought together by fate. Words were unnecessary, the silence spoke volumes. It was a rare reprieve for Ragnar, who had long been a man defined by violence and noise. As he worked, he caught a glimpse of the crucifix hidden beneath the layers of the girl's tattered clothes, a small wooden cross worn smooth by time and touch. The symbol stirred something deep within him, a reminder of the invisible worlds that clashed quietly beneath the surface of their brutal reality. Yet he did not speak of it, sensing the fragility of the moment. Instead, he reached for a thick woolen blanket, wrapping it gently around Ira's slender shoulders. The warmth seeped slowly into her bones, drawing a soft sigh from the child as her frame relaxed ever so slightly. Ragnar settled beside her, the rough edge of his cloak brushing against her small form. "Where do you come from?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a murmur. Ira's eyes flickered to the flickering flames, shadows dancing in their depths. "A village," she said simply, her voice fragile but steady. "Far from here, across the water. The Saxons, they came in the night, burned everything. I ran." Her words hung in the thickening air, heavy with sorrow and loss.
Ragnar's jaw tightened, the familiar knot of anger surfacing. The Saxons had been enemies for as long as he could remember. Invaders, killers, the threat at the edge of his world. Yet here was a child who had suffered beneath the same cold hand of fate. He reached out instinctively, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. The gesture was tentative, almost awkward, but it spoke of something long denied, a desire to protect, to care, to hold. Ira did not flinch. Instead, her eyes met his, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Time slipped by in the small cabin, the hours marked only by the steady crackle of fire and the distant call of ravens circling outside. Ragnar found his thoughts drifting, memories of a son he had never met, of a woman lost to the tides of war and absence. The child before him was a mirror of what might have been, fragile, vulnerable, yet unbowed. He laid out a small bed of furs near the hearth, coaxing Ira toward it with quiet patience. She climbed beneath the covers, curling into the soft skins as if seeking refuge from the world's harsh edges. Ragnar settled beside her, the weight of his axe resting against the wall, a silent guardian in the growing darkness. The night deepened, and the air grew still, except for the gentle rise and fall of the child's breath. Ragnar's eyes remained open, staring into the flickering shadows. The bond between them, born in the cold and forged beneath the moonlight, pressed heavily on his soul. He wondered what the future held, whether the fragile trust they had built would survive the storms to come, or whether the unforgiving winds of fate would tear them apart once more. Outside, the world remained unchanged, harsh, brutal, and indifferent. But within the walls of that small cabin, a flicker of something new had taken root, a promise whispered between two souls from opposite worlds, a fragile hope born from shared humanity. Ragnar reached out, his hand resting lightly on Ira's shoulder. The child stirred, eyes fluttering open in the dim firelight. She looked at him with a quiet strength that belied her years, and in that gaze he found a reflection of his own buried heart. No words were needed. The night held its secrets close, but beneath the cold and shadows something warmer burned, a connection that neither blood nor war could sever. For now, in this fragile sanctuary, they were simply two souls seeking shelter from the storm, and in the silence between them, an unlikely family began to form. The sharp bite of winter's chill lingered in the air as the fragile alliance of three, Ragnar, Aethelstan, and Thora, pressed onward along the jagged coastline. The waves crashed relentlessly against the black rocks, a persistent reminder of the unforgiving world they had left behind. Each step carried the weight of exile, and the cold wind seemed to carry whispers from the camp they had abandoned, carried by the frost-bitten breeze like a ghostly warning. They traveled with caution, their presence marked only by the faint impressions left in the snow and the occasional flickering ember from the dying fire that Thora carried in a small carved wooden bowl. The seer's aged hands trembled with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve, her pale eyes scanning the horizon with a wisdom born of many winters and countless visions. The news of the Saxons' unexpected release rippled quickly through the clan, spreading like wildfire amid the biting cold. The shattered ritual, the betrayal of sacred customs, and the defiance of Gunnar the Jarl became the talk of every hearth and every whispered conversation. Men who had once revered Ragnar now saw him as a traitor, a threat to the fragile order that bound them together through blood and honor. As the days passed, their flight through the wilderness became a desperate struggle to remain unseen. Hunters from neighboring clans, drawn by the promise of bounty or vengeance, prowled the same forests and hills. Their keen eyes searched for any sign of the fugitives.
The very earth beneath their feet seemed to conspire with the cold and shadows to reveal their path. One evening, as they paused in the shelter of a dense copse of fir trees, Thora lowered her bowl, her breath shallow and uneven. "The eyes of the world are upon us," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rustling branches. "Our enemies gather like wolves on the wind." Ragnar's gaze hardened. "We cannot stop. If they catch us, none will be spared. Not the Saxon, not the child, not myself." Aethelstan, still bearing the wounds of his captivity and the tentative hope of freedom, nodded grimly. "Then we must move faster. The Saxons to the south will not welcome me, but perhaps they will hear my words before the hunters find us." The tension coiled tighter around them with each passing hour. Threats came not only from those who once stood beside Ragnar, but also from shadows beyond their knowledge. Strangers with unknown allegiances, mercenaries seeking favor, and even whispers of Saxon scouts on their trail. The fragile hope forged under Moonlight was now a beacon, drawing danger ever closer. In a rare moment of quiet, as the trio made camp beneath a broad canopy of ancient pines, Thora traced the runes upon her staff and whispered a prayer to the old gods. "The threads of fate are tangled. The path ahead is dark, yet the dawn may still break." Ragnar sat apart, the flickering firelight casting shadows across his scarred face. His thoughts drifted back to the camp, now a place of judgment and anger. He heard the accusing voices of his kin, the final condemnation that severed him from the only family he had ever known. The bitter sting of banishment was a wound that festered deeper than any blade. Yet the decision that had fractured his world was rooted in something older, something enduring.
The memory of Aethelstan's calm eyes, the reflection of a man who, beneath enemy armor, bore the same burdens of fatherhood and loss. The image of Ira, the fragile child whose trust had kindled a spark within him long considered extinguished. These faces pushed against the cold walls of his heart, demanding he stand. "Why do you stay with me?" Ragnar suddenly asked Aethelstan as they shared a sparse meal. "You could leave, go your own way." Aethelstan met his gaze steadily. "Because you saved me, and because I cannot abandon those who have taken a risk for me. The world is cruel enough without adding betrayal to its list." A faint smile touched Ragnar's lips, a rare softness in a hardened warrior. "There is more courage in your words than many who brandish sword and shield." But the reprieve was brief. The following morning brought with it the scent of smoke and the sharp crack of twigs breaking under heavy boots. From the edge of the trees, a small band of men emerged, clad in leathers marked by the insignias of a rival clan, their eyes cold and unyielding. "We seek Ragnar Thorvaldsen," their leader called out, his voice ringing clear and authoritative. "He who defies the sacred laws must answer for his deeds." Ragnar rose, muscles tensed beneath his worn tunic. Beside him, Aethelstan shifted, hands clenched, the resolve of a warrior rekindled. Thora steadied her staff, her gaze piercing like the edge of a blade. "We are no threat unless provoked," Ragnar said, voice low but commanding. "Turn back, and you may yet live in peace." The leader's eyes narrowed. "Peace is a luxury for the faithful. You have broken faith. The gods demand retribution." Steel gleamed in the dim light as swords were drawn. The fugitives had no real choice. They prepared to fight, not for glory, but for survival. The clash was brief but fierce. Ragnar's strength and fury surged like a tempest, while Aethelstan's battle-hardened skill cut through the enemy's ranks. Thora's voice rose in ancient chants, weaving protection into the chaos. When the dust settled, the rival clan lay scattered, some dead, others fleeing with broken limbs and shattered pride. Yet the victory was hollow. They had revealed their position. "We cannot linger," Thora warned, breathless. "More will come. The world is closing in." Days blurred into nights as the trio pressed onward, always moving, never resting fully. The wilderness offered scant refuge. The cold gnawed at their bones, hunger sharpened their senses, and the relentless pressure of pursuit frayed their nerves. In quiet moments, Ragnar wrestled with the weight of his choices. The cost of mercy was clear, and yet, in the eyes of Aethelstan and the fragile hope embodied by the child they protected, he found a reason to endure. The world beyond the forest was no safer. Rumors of the escaped Saxon and the exiled Berserker traveled before them, stirring distrust among neighboring tribes and sending messages to distant rulers.
Letters tied to ravens spoke of treachery and broken oaths, and the name of Ragnar Thorvaldsson became a curse and a warning. One evening, as the trio approached a small settlement on the fringe of Saxon lands, a figure awaited them in the shadows, a messenger cloaked in dark furs, bearing a sealed scroll emblazoned with the mark of Gunnar's jarlship. Ragnar took the scroll with hands both steady and trembling. Breaking the wax revealed words heavy with accusation and command, orders for his immediate capture and execution, branding him a traitor and a danger to all who followed the old ways. Aethelstan's jaw tightened. Your clan would rather see you dead than question their customs. Thora's eyes clouded with sorrow. The world is cruel to those who walk the line between worlds. They faced a grim truth. The sanctuary they sought did not exist freely in this fractured land. Every step forward drew them deeper into a web of suspicion, hostility, and the relentless pursuit of vengeance. As dusk fell, Ragnar stared out over the rolling hills. The horizon stretched wide but unforgiving. The secret shared beneath the moonlight had sparked a fire that now threatened to consume them all. Yet within that fire burned a fragile hope, a hope that even in exile and shadow, humanity might find a way to endure. And so they moved forward, three souls bound by defiance, by mercy, and by the quiet power of a secret no clan could forgive. The dawn broke over a sky heavy with steel-gray clouds, the pale light struggling to pierce the relentless cold that gripped the land. The jagged coastline stretched before them like a frozen wound, the sea's dark waves crashing ceaselessly against unforgiving stone. Ragnar, Aethelstan, and Thora pressed on, worn, hunted, but unyielding. Their footsteps left shallow impressions in the snow-dusted earth, fleeting marks destined to be swallowed by the next wind or tide. Yet with every step, the weight of exile deepened, each breath a reminder that the world they once knew was gone. Behind them, the whispered rumors of betrayal and defiance had spread like wildfire through the Viking clans. Gunnar's fury burned hotter than any forge, and his commands echoed across the cold lands with merciless resolve. Ragnar Thorvaldsson, once the feared Wolf-Tooth, was now the clan's most wanted enemy, marked for death for the sin of mercy. The Jarl's men, ruthless and relentless, had scoured the forests and hills, leaving no stone unturned, no path safe. On this morning, the hunters closed in. The three fugitives halted beneath the gnarled limbs of a withered pine, their breaths rising in white clouds that vanished into the frosty air. Thora's aged fingers tightened around her staff, the runes etched deep into the ancient wood, shimmering faintly with the remnants of her whispered incantations. Her pale eyes, clouded like winter ice, scanned the shadowed tree line, sensing the tightening noose.
"They come," she murmured, voice brittle but resolute. "The wolf's den will not remain hidden." Ragnar's hand tightened on the haft of his axe, the familiar weight grounding him even as his heart pounded with the storm of inevitability. He shared a brief glance with Aethelstan, the Saxon's sharp blue eyes steady beneath the grime and exhaustion, reflecting the battle-hardened spirit that had refused to be broken. Beside them, Ira stirred quietly beneath the furs they had wrapped her in, the fragile child's presence a silent tether to a world far removed from the brutal warrior's fate. "Let them come," Ragnar said, voice low and grim. "Better to meet death with steel than to die hunted like beasts." The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the silence stretching taut as a bowstring. Then, from the shadows, the first shapes emerged, a dozen or more men, clad in the dark leathers and furs that marked Gunnar's loyal hunters. Their faces were hard and unyielding, eyes gleaming with the cold fire of vengeance. Their leader, a large man with a jagged scar tracing down his cheek, stepped forward, sword drawn and ready. "Ragnar Thorvaldsson," the hunter called out, voice harsh as the winter wind. "You stand accused of treason against the clan, of breaking sacred oaths and dishonoring Odin's will. Surrender now, and your death will be swift." Ragnar's jaw clenched, the bitter taste of blood rising in his mouth, both from old wounds and the rage that refused to be quelled. "I am no traitor," he growled. "I did what the gods could not see. Mercy is not betrayal." Aethelstan shifted beside him, the faint scars on his hands flexing as he gripped the hilt of a stolen sword, a weapon snatched during the chaos of their flight. "You came for mercy," the Saxon said, voice calm but edged with defiance. The hunting party closed in, circling like wolves ready to tear. The snow beneath their feet was stained with the echoes of past battles, the frozen ground a silent witness to the blood that had been spilled and would be again. Thora stepped forward, raising her staff high as she chanted in a voice that wavered but carried the weight of ancient power. The runes on the staff glowed faintly, casting eerie patterns of light and shadow across friend and foe alike. "The gods watch," she intoned, "and the threads of fate are woven by many hands. This path, chosen by blood and mercy, will not end in dishonor." The hunters hesitated, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Gunnar's edict was clear, but the seer's words carried a weight of their own, a challenge to the iron laws that had governed the clan for centuries. From the back of the group, a new figure emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with gray. Gunnar Sigurdsson, the Jarl himself, stepped into the clearing, his presence commanding immediate attention. His eyes, sharp and unforgiving, locked onto Ragnar with a mixture of fury and disbelief.
"You stand here, defying your own blood," Gunnar's voice boomed, cold as the northern wind. "You desecrated the sacred rites and brought shame upon us all. You chose a Saxon's life over your own clan's honor." Ragnar met the Jarl's gaze without flinching, the fury that had driven him tempered now by a deeper, harder resolve. "I chose what no man dared," he said steadily, "to see a man beyond his banner and blade, to spare a life when death was expected. Call it treason, call it weakness, but I call it truth." Gunnar's hand went to the hilt of his ancestral sword, the amber-inlaid pommel gleaming ominously. "Then you will answer to Odin himself. This trial will be your last."
Without further warning, the air erupted into chaos. Swords were drawn and clashed with the metallic ring of death. Ragnar's axe sang through the bitter air, its heavy blade striking with the fury of years spent in war. Beside him, Aethelstan fought with the precision and speed of a seasoned warrior, his Saxon training blending with the hardened instincts forged in captivity and escape. The hunters pressed relentlessly, but the defenders moved with desperate clarity. Each blow was a statement, a refusal to bow to fate or fear. Yet the numbers were against them. Thora's chant wove through the fray, a fragile shield against the overwhelming storm. In the midst of battle, Gunnar advanced, his sword flashing like a serpent's strike. He cut through the chaos, eyes locked on his betrayer. Ragnar met him head-on, the clash of metal ringing out as the two titans collided. The Jarl's strength was formidable, his strikes calculated and brutal. But Ragnar's berserker rage surged anew, fueled by the desperate need to protect what little remained. Their blades danced in a deadly rhythm, sparks flying as steel met steel. Gunnar's voice was a roar, filled with accusation and pain. "You dishonor us all! Your name will be forgotten, your blood cursed!" "And what of your own sins?" Ragnar spat, parrying a vicious blow. "How many have you sent to die for greed and fear? Where was your mercy when the fires burned in Saxon villages?" The words struck Gunnar like a blow, his fury momentarily faltering. The Jarl's eyes darkened with conflicted rage, but his resolve hardened again with a grim set to his jaw. Meanwhile, Aethelstan fought back-to-back with Ragnar, protecting the vulnerable child who had remained hidden in the shelter of the nearby rocks. His sword carved a path through the hunters, each strike a testament to his will to survive and honor the fragile bonds that had formed between enemies. But even as the battle raged, the odds shifted. More hunters poured from the tree line, their war cries piercing the air, their blades thirsty for vengeance. Ragnar knew the fight could not last. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and exhausted. Thora's voice rose again, louder now, filled with both warning and plea. "Enough! The gods demand justice, but also balance."
"Your fury blinds you, Gunnar." The Jarl's gaze flicked to the seer, her presence reminding him of the ancient powers that held sway beyond mortal quarrels. The warriors paused, the breath of battle held suspended for a fragile moment. Gunnar's sword lowered slightly, though his eyes remained hard. "I do what must be done to keep the clan strong." Ragnar, chest heaving, pushed himself up, the blood and sweat on his skin mingling with the cold sting of winter. "Strength is not only forged in blood," he said quietly, eyes burning with the fire of conviction. "Sometimes it is found in mercy." The silence that followed was heavy, the tension thick as the gray clouds above. The hunter's blades wavered, uncertain. The fragile line between justice and vengeance blurred in the cold light of dawn. Gunnar sheathed his sword with a slow, deliberate motion. "You will leave this land. You will take your Saxon and your witch and vanish from our sight. You are cast out. No longer brother, no longer kin." Ragnar nodded, the bitter weight of exile settling over him like a shroud. "So be it." Thora stepped beside him, her staff tapping softly against the frozen ground. "May the gods watch over those who walk the shadowed path." Aethelstan sheathed his sword, stepping forward with quiet dignity. "We will not forget the cost of this mercy." As the hunters withdrew, the fragile alliance of three, warrior,
prisoner, seer, stood together, bound by choices that had shattered worlds and forged new ones. The dawn's pale light cast long shadows behind them, but before them stretched a path unknown, a path where old enemies might become family, and where the true battle for honor had only just begun. The cold sea breeze bit sharply at their faces, carrying with it the salt of the restless waves crashing below the cliffs. The weight of exile pressed heavily on Ragnar's shoulders, a burden as tangible as the wolf-fur cloak that shielded him from the worst of the wind. Beside him, Aethelstan's steady gaze met the horizon with unyielding resolve, his hands still trembling faintly from the scars of battle and captivity. Thora's pale eyes, clouded with age and sightless in many ways, seemed to pierce the very fabric of the world, reading the currents of fate that swirled invisibly around them. For days they had wandered the harsh wilderness, hunted and hunted again, always on the edge of survival, always one step ahead of death. Yet despite the constant danger, a fragile peace had begun to settle among them. It was not the peace of safety or ease, but a quiet truce forged from shared hardship and a growing understanding between souls once divided by blood and bitter history. Ragnar's mind drifted back to the chaos of the battle beneath the ancient pines, the clash of steel, and the thunder of war cries that echoed through the forest.
There, amid the fury and desperation, he had glimpsed something he had long forgotten, the possibility of mercy, even in a world defined by violence. His decision to spare Aethelstan's life had shattered the sacred customs of his clan, severed the ties that bound him to his people, and marked him as a traitor. Yet, in that moment of defiance, he had reclaimed a part of himself buried beneath years of rage and bloodshed. And now, as the wind tugged at their cloaks and the sea roared beneath them, Ragnar wondered if redemption was ever truly possible for a man like him. The fragile peace was shattered by a sudden cry from the cliffs below. Ira, the small girl whose fate had become entwined with theirs, clung tightly to Thora's hand, her blue eyes wide with fear. Ragnar's gaze snapped downward, and he saw a group of figures emerging from the tree line, moving swiftly toward them. "Hunters," Thora whispered, her voice thin but steady. "They come again." Ragnar's grip tightened on the haft of his axe, the familiar weight grounding him, even as his heart thundered with the rising storm. This was not just a fight for survival anymore. It was a test of the fragile bonds they had forged. And though the odds were grim, he would not allow those bonds to be severed now. As the hunters approached, Ragnar stepped forward, his height and imposing presence marking him as the leader of the ragged group. The men carried weapons, but their faces held something more than hostility. There was hesitation, a flicker of doubt that had not been there before. Their leader, a burly man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, stopped a few paces from Ragnar. His eyes flicked over the small group, over the pale, determined faces of the Saxon and the seer, over the fragile figure of the child, and finally resting on Ragnar himself. "Ragnar Thorvaldsson," the man said, voice low but firm. "You stand before your kin once more, but not as a brother. You broke sacred laws. You betrayed the clan." Ragnar met the man's gaze without flinching. "I did what no man dared," he said quietly. "I saw a man beyond the color of his blood, a father, a protector, a soul." His voice carried the weight of years spent in battle and solitude. "I chose mercy, and for that I am cast out." The hunters exchanged uneasy glances. Among them, a few voices whispered, questioning the harsh judgment, the rigid laws that had ruled their lives for so long. It was a subtle shift, like the first stirrings of thaw beneath winter's grip.
Before the tension could escalate, Aethelstan stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "You see a Saxon before you," he said, "but I see a man who spared my life when death was certain. I owe him that debt, and more. We are bound by more than blood and war. We are bound by the choices we make." His words hung in the cold air, carrying a sincerity that reached beyond the fear and anger of the moment.
The hunters looked at each other, the rigid lines of their faces softening, if only for a moment. Ira, clutching Thora's hand, stepped forward as well, her small voice breaking the silence. "He saved me," she said simply. "He kept me safe when the world was cruel." The child's words stirred something deep within the gathered men, reminders of the fragile lives they all sought to protect beneath the armor of warriors. Thora's voice rose then, carrying the wisdom of many winters. The gods see not only the blood spilled, but also the mercy shown. The strength of a clan is measured not just by the sword, but by the hearts of those who wield it. The leader's eyes locked on to Thora's, searching for a hint of falsehood, but found only truth. Slowly he lowered his weapon. The others followed suit, the tension easing as the first threads of understanding wove through the crowd. "You have brought shame to the clan," the man said, voice still heavy with pain. "But perhaps there is more to honor than we knew." Ragnar's shoulders sagged with the weight of relief and exhaustion. He had not sought forgiveness, nor had he expected it. But in this moment, a moment forged in the harsh fires of conflict and tempered by acts of unexpected compassion, it seemed that even the coldest hearts could begin to thaw. Among the gathered men, a few stepped forward, cautious but sincere. One placed a hand on Ragnar's broad shoulder, a gesture heavy with meaning. "Your path is hard," he said, "but maybe it leads to a future we cannot yet see." The clan's hunters began to disperse, their weapons sheathed and their faces shadowed with contemplation. The wind carried away their footsteps, leaving behind a fragile silence filled with possibility. As the sun dipped low beneath the horizon, painting the sky with shades of blood and amber, Ragnar stood beside Aethelstan and Thora. The child, wrapped in furs, nestled close to the seer's side. Together they faced the uncertain road ahead, scarred, hunted, but united. Ragnar's gaze lingered on the distant fires of the camp they had left behind, the memories of betrayal and exile mingling with the hope born from an unspoken promise. The secret shared beneath the moonlight, the choice to see beyond enemies and cast aside old hatreds, had come at a great cost. But in return, it had given them something far rarer, a chance at redemption. For the first time in many winters, Ragnar allowed himself to believe that the wolf's teeth around his neck might one day symbolize not just death, but the endurance of a spirit that refused to be broken. And as the night settled around them, the faint glow of the stars above whispered of a future where old wounds might heal, where enemies might become kin, and where the fierce fire of humanity could burn brighter than the darkest shadows of war. The first snow of early winter had settled softly over the village like a quiet blessing, a thin white blanket that muted the sounds of life but seemed to deepen the colors beneath it, the dark bark of trees, the rough stone of hearths, the weathered faces of those who had endured so much. The wind, less biting now, whispered through the narrow streets and around the sturdy wooden homes, carrying the scent of burning wood and fresh earth turned for planting.
It was a season of endings and beginnings, a time when the old gods turned their gaze toward the cycles of death and rebirth. The village itself had changed, though its shape remained familiar. Cracks in the walls were repaired, fences that once sagged under the weight of neglect stood straight and proud once more. The great hall, where the clan had gathered for generations, echoed with new voices. Voices that sang old songs with a fresh hope, telling stories not just of conquest and bloodshed, but of mercy, kinship, and the fragile ties that bind enemies into family. Ragnar Thorvaldsson, once exiled and branded a traitor, now walked among his people with a different kind of strength. The wolf's teeth that hung heavy around his neck no longer felt like cold trophies of death, but bones of a past that had been shed like an old skin. His gait was steadier, the tension in his shoulders softened, though the scars on his face and body told tales of battles that would never fade. His eyes, still sharp and gray-green, held something new. A quiet patience, the weight of a man who had faced the abyss and returned changed. The villagers watched him with a mixture of cautious respect and reluctant acceptance. Some had never believed the stories of his betrayal. Others still whispered in corners about the sacrilege he had committed by sparing the Saxon prisoner. But time, as ever, was a slow healer. The harsh winter months gave space for reflection, and the thaw that followed brought with it a subtle shift in hearts. Aethelstan, too, had found a place among them, not as an outsider, but as a man who carried the marks of hardship and the quiet dignity of one who had survived the worst. His broad frame, once restrained by chains and wounds, moved now with a careful grace. His blue eyes clear and steady beneath the heavy furs he wore against the cold. The crucifix hidden beneath his tunic was no longer a secret. It was a symbol quietly respected, a testament to the complexities of faith and identity woven through the frozen lands. The bond between Ragnar and Aethelstan had not faded with exile. It had grown, deepened by shared trials and the silent understanding born from nights spent beneath the same stars, faces turned toward the unknown. Together they had weathered storms, both of nature and of men, and found something rare and precious in the fractures of their worlds, trust. Thora Velvadotir, the seer, whose wisdom had guided them through the darkest hours, remained a pillar in the village.
Her once stooped shoulders seemed less burdened now, and her pale eyes sparkled faintly as she walked through the markets and gatherings, speaking softly with those who would listen. She had become a bridge between the old ways and the new, weaving ancient runes with stories that embraced change without forgetting the past. The child Era had grown stronger each day. The shadows in her eyes had lessened, replaced by a resilient light that belied her years. She moved through the village with a quiet confidence, her small hands no longer trembling, but steady and sure. Under Thora's patient care, she learned the old songs and the meanings behind the symbols carved into wood and stone. Yet her laughter, rare but genuine, was the true sign of healing in a place marked by sorrow. One clear morning, as the sun spilled pale gold across the frost-kissed fields, the village gathered around the great hall for a gathering unlike any before. The air was crisp, the breath of the crowd rising in white plumes against the brightening sky. The elders sat on carved benches. The young warriors stood with careful attention, and the children, bundled tightly, watched with wide, curious eyes. Ragnar stepped forward, his towering frame casting a long shadow in the morning light. He carried no weapon today, only the weight of his words and the history that clung to his broad shoulders. His gaze swept across the faces before him, some wary, others hopeful. "My clan," he began, voice steady but low. "The gods have tested us.
Their will is not always clear, and their paths are not always easy to walk. A pause, heavy with meaning. I was once cast out for choosing mercy over blood, for seeing a man where others saw only an enemy. Murmurs stirred in the crowd, but he raised a hand to still them. But in mercy we find strength. In understanding we find the ties that bind us beyond war and hatred. Aethelstan is no longer a prisoner, he is a brother. And Ira, who carries the light of hope, is family. He motioned to the two standing beside him, the Saxon warrior and the young girl whose fate had entwined with their own. Aethelstan nodded, his voice steady as he spoke. The lands beyond carry many wounds, but they also hold the promise of peace. I will speak for you, for us, when I return to my people. Thora stepped forward next, her voice carrying the weight of years and visions. The old ways bend, but they do not break. We honor the gods not only with blood, but with the courage to change. This village will remember that. A new tradition was born that day, not marked by sacrifice and rage, but by a vow to hold mercy alongside honor, to seek strength in compassion, and to bind the wounds of the past with the threads of kinship. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Ragnar lingered near the edge of the gathering, watching the children play in the snow, their laughter a fragile melody against the harsh backdrop of the world.
Ira ran to him, cheeks flushed with cold and joy, her small hands clasping his heavy ones. "Will you stay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ragnar knelt, meeting her gaze. "For you and for this place I will stay." His voice was thick with a promise forged in fire and frost. In the days that followed, news came from the north, a message carried by ravens swift and sure. It spoke of new alliances, tentative peace talks, and the slow unraveling of old hostilities. Aethelstan's words had reached ears once closed, opening doors to a future where enemies might stand side by side. Yet even as hope blossomed, Ragnar knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. The scars of exile and betrayal left marks deeper than flesh. The old ways were not so easily cast aside, and the shadows of the past would linger like winter's chill. But in the quiet moments beneath the endless sky, as the stars wheeled overhead and the northern lights painted the heavens in ghostly hues, Ragnar found solace. The secret shared under the moonlight, that moment of mercy that had shattered worlds, had not been in vain. It had forged a new path. A path where the wolf's tooth necklace was not a symbol of death, but of the enduring spirit of a man who dared to see beyond the blade. Where a Saxon prisoner could become a brother, and where a child, once lost and broken, could find a home. The village, scarred but unbroken, embraced this new dawn. The old songs were sung with fresh voices. The fires burned steadily, casting warmth and light into the long northern nights. And somewhere deep within, the gods watched, not with wrath, but perhaps with something rarer, a quiet, knowing grace. For in the end, the greatest battles are not always fought with axe and sword, but with the courage to change, to forgive, and to forge family from the unlikeliest of places. And so, beneath the watchful stars and the eternal sky, a new story began. The story of a berserker, a Saxon, a seer, and a child, bound by blood and mercy, exile and hope. They carried the fragile torch of humanity into the long, uncertain night. Their footsteps faded into the snow, but their legacy would burn on, like the fire that warms the coldest winter, like the bonds that outlast even the deepest wounds. A new cycle had begun. The cold had finally begun to relent, the harsh grip of early winter thawing ever so slightly as the sun traced a pale arc across the sky.
The village, once fractured by suspicion and shadowed by betrayal, now breathed with a slow but steady pulse, an awakening that stirred quietly beneath the surface of worn stone and weathered wood. The passage of time had smoothed some edges, though the scars remained etched deep into the hearts of those who called this place home. Ragnar Thorvaldsson stood alone at the crest of a hill overlooking the sprawling settlement.
The wind tugged softly at the wolf fur draped over his broad shoulders, carrying with it the mingled scents of smoke, earth, and distant salt from the sea. His eyes, sharp and steady, traced the familiar shapes of homes and fields below, a landscape steeped in memory and marked by resilience. He had walked a hard road to reach this moment, a path carved not only by axe and blood, but by the fragile threads of mercy and kinship. Beneath the weight of exile, he had found a new kind of strength. The wolf's teeth around his neck, once cold trophies of death, now felt like relics of a past he had shed, reminders not just of what he had taken, but of what he had chosen to save. The faces of those who had stood beside him, Aethelstan, the Saxon warrior who had been more than an enemy, Thora, the seer whose wisdom had pierced the darkness, and Ira, the child who carried hope like a flame, were etched into his soul. They had become family, bound by choices that no clan had sanctioned, but the gods themselves seemed to watch with a quiet grace. The village stirred beneath him. Men and women moved with purpose, their faces marked by the hard seasons, but softened by the slow thaw of understanding. Children's laughter, tentative but genuine, echoed across the frost-kissed fields, where once only silence had reigned. The great hall stood proudly at the center, its wooden beams weathered but strong, a symbol of endurance and the new bonds woven through the threads of time. Ragnar's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the sun cast long shadows upon the rugged hills. The world beyond still held dangers, old wounds yet to heal, and the weight of old grudges that clung like winter's chill. Yet here, in this place forged by fire and frost, a fragile peace had taken root, a peace born not from conquest or blood, but from the courage to see beyond the blade. He remembered the night of the moon, the secret shared beneath cold silver light that had shattered worlds and forged new ones. The memory was sharp, the echo of Aethelstan's calm eyes meeting his, the touch of that brief kindness, the unspoken promise that had changed everything. It was a moment of reckoning, a choice that had cost him everything, and yet offered the possibility of something greater. There was no triumph in his heart, no easy victory, only the quiet knowledge that the path of mercy is often the loneliest and the hardest to walk. For every step forward there had been resistance. For every act of compassion, the sting of betrayal. The old ways were not easily forsaken, and the shadows of the past still whispered in the night. But the dawn was breaking. He turned from the hill, his boots crunching softly on the frost-hardened earth as he made his way back to the village. The wind carried the faint strains of song, voices raised in cautious hope and remembrance. It was a new song, one for those who had lost and found, for enemies who had become brothers, for the fragile ties that hold a clan together beyond blood. Aethelstan stood near the hearth in the great hall, his broad frame relaxed but alert. His blue eyes met Ragnar's with a quiet steadfastness that spoke of trust earned and honored. Thora sat nearby, her frail hands weaving runes with practiced grace, her pale gaze steady as ever despite the passing years. Ira laughed softly as she played in the corner, her small hands shaping figures from clay, the spark of life burning brighter with each day.
Together, they were a testament to the possibility that even in a world built on war and sacrifice, humanity could endure. Ragnar's voice broke the soft murmur of the room. "We have walked through fire and shadow," he said, his tone low but steady. "The gods test us, not only in battle, but in the choices we make when no one watches. Mercy is not weakness. It is the fiercest kind of strength." The clan, gathered here in cautious assembly, listened. Some eyes were wary, others filled with a hesitant acceptance. Time had not erased the memory of his betrayal, but it had softened the edges of anger. Thora rose slowly, her voice carrying the weight of ages. "The old gods honor those who walk the shadowed path with courage. The runes tell of cycles, death and rebirth, endings and beginnings. What has been broken may yet be made whole." Ira, her small voice clear and unwavering, added, "We are stronger when we stand together, not as enemies, but as family." Aethelstan stepped forward, his presence commanding even in the modest hall. "The lands beyond are still torn. But if we carry this hope with us, if we speak with truth, perhaps the cycle will change. Perhaps the enemy will see the man beyond the shield." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. A challenge to the old order, a call to a new way. Ragnar's gaze swept across the faces before him, the hardened warriors, the weathered elders, the children with eyes full of tomorrow. His heart, long guarded behind layers of fury and scars, stirred with a quiet resolve. The fires of the hall crackled, casting flickering light upon the walls adorned with symbols of gods and ancestors. Outside, the world remained vast and uncertain, but within this place, a new story was being written. A story not of conquest, but of mercy. Not of division, but of unity. He thought of the wolf's tooth necklace resting against his chest, a symbol of the past that had shaped him, but not defined him. The teeth were trophies, yes, but now they felt like the bones of a life left behind, a life reborn through the courage to choose a different path. The northern sky darkened as the sun dipped low, stars beginning to pierce the twilight. Ragnar stepped outside, the cool night air a balm and a reminder. The moon rose, pale and steady, casting its silver light over the world below.
He raised his eyes to the heavens, feeling the ancient power of the gods in the cold wind and the silent stars. The secret shared beneath that same moonlight, the moment when a berserker faltered and saw a man where others saw only an enemy, had been a turning point. Not just for him, but for all who would hear this story. The path ahead would be long and fraught with hardship. Old grudges would not vanish with a single act of mercy, and the scars borne by many would take time to heal. Yet the seed had been planted, a seed watered by courage and compassion. Ragnar breathed deeply, the chill air filling his lungs and grounding him in the present. He knew the night still held shadows, that the world was a harsh and unforgiving place. But beneath that darkness there burned a quiet fire, the fire of humanity, of connection, of hope. As he turned back toward the village, his footsteps steady and sure, the soft sound of voices carried on the wind. Stories would be told of this night, of a berserker who chose mercy over blood, of a Saxon who became brother, of a seer who saw beyond sight itself, and of a child who embodied the fragile promise of tomorrow. And somewhere, in the silence between the stars, the old gods watched, not with wrath, but with a knowing grace. For in the end, the greatest battles are not always fought with axe and sword, but with the courage to change, to forgive, and to forge family from the unlikeliest of places. The night held its secrets close, but beneath the cold and shadows something warmer burned. A bond stronger than blood, older than war. A light that would guide those who dared to follow. And as the moon sailed high above the northern lands, the whisper lingered on the wind, that sometimes the fiercest warrior is the one who chooses mercy. If this story stirred something deep within, if the flicker of humanity beneath the armor called to you, then join us again. Subscribe and walk with us through the shadows and fires of Viking worlds yet to come. Because these tales are not just echoes of the past. They are reflections of the truths waiting to be found within us all. And remember, in that night between fire and ice, they learned that compassion may be the fiercest weapon of a Viking.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.